BloombergQuint. Now, the Supreme Court today ordered that states will bear the cost of transporting migrant workers to their homes, that states and railways should provide food and water at train and bus stations as well as on the journey. States have been directed to oversee the registration of migrant workers and ensure the trains and buses are available at the earliest to transport them to their home states. Railways have also been told to provide trains as requested by states. This is what a three-judge bench said verbally in court today while delivering its order. The next hearing on this matter is scheduled for June 5th. Now, while this seems to be an expected response of the higher judiciary to a humanitarian crisis, let me tell you it's not, and for two reasons. First, the Supreme Court did precious little when this matter was first brought to them through a variety of PILs or petitions, at least 5 to the last count. Thereafter, the court decided suddenly to take suo motu cognizance of this issue, prompting today's hearing and today's order. The second reason for why this was an extraordinary hearing was some of the arguments put forward by the Solicitor General of India, Dushyant Dave, who is arguing for the central government. Now, I will come to those arguments in due course, but before that, let me introduce my guest for the evening, noted Supreme Court lawyer Dushyant Dave. Mr. Dave, thank you very much for joining us here on BloombergQuint.
Hello.
Sir, you said in recent public comments in which you implored the Supreme Court to intervene in this humanitarian crisis that we've seen playing out on our streets and on our highways, you said the dignity of hundreds and millions of citizens has been completely taken away, and yet the Supreme Court simply has said, how can we stop them from walking? What prevents individual judges of the Supreme Court from taking suo motu cognizance of these matters? You asked. Then you said, can you imagine every migrant family walking on the roads and what they must be going through? And you finally said that when history is written 100 years down the road, we will all be condemned. Are you satisfied with what the Supreme Court has ordered today?
Well, yes and no. I can only say, as the adage goes by, better late than never. But who will compensate for the sufferings of those hundreds of millions since to 23rd of March 2020? And it is impossible ever to conceive, much less actually compensate for their sufferings. So, I mean, yes, it is a beginning in the right direction, but I must confess it is too little and too late. And but in one sense, one does feel satisfied that at least the court has now decided to intervene, because unfortunately, the Supreme Court, since 2014, when Prime Minister Modi took over, has virtually ceded the territory to the executive and has refused to seriously question the executive actions, however right or wrong they were, in very, very important matters relating to public interest and public issues. So I think time has come for the Supreme Court to introspect, and I would beseech with folded to the Supreme Court that it must seriously, introspect that its role is to critically examine every decision of the government, however, good it may appear to be, however well it may be projected by the executive, because it is only the Supreme Court which can stand between the tyranny of the executive and the rights, including the fundamental rights of the citizens. Nobody else can, really look after the welfare of the citizens. So this is perhaps a time for the Supreme Court to start seriously introspecting, and maybe today's is a good beginning. And I'm really, in that one sense, little sense, definitely satisfied. Although I would have liked Supreme Court to look into or look after the welfare of the people right from 23rd of March, when a lockdown was declared with 4 hours notice, which was wholly arbitrary and unconstitutional.
Mr. Dave, you said too little, too late. I get the too late bit, but why do you say too little? What more do you think the Supreme Court can do?
Well, the Supreme Court, you have to understand, Menaka, that the issue is not now limited to merely taking the migrant workers to their homes. That's one leg of their journey. Question is, how are they going to survive at their homes in villages for next few weeks or months and a long time? They have no income. There is no livelihood. How are they going to really survive and feed their families? The agricultural sector is unable to really look after them. That's precisely the reason why they have come to the cities to earn. So it is a combined earning from the, by the migrant worker in the cities and factories, and little income from the agriculture, which can really keep those families alive. Now that big source of income gone, how are they going to live? And what is the government going to do about it? And what has the Supreme Court thought about it? So that is one thing which is really very worrisome, because you must realize one thing, Menaka. These people today, I can assure you, have lost faith in the nation. They know that this nation has failed them from 23rd of March and left them to fend for themselves. Can you imagine? Can you go into their psyche to understand what they have gone through? Will they ever trust you and me, or the government, or the Supreme Court? It is impossible to conceive a situation of their psychological conditions. Now, if that be so, they will take a long time for even to think to come back to cities and start working in those factories and mills and services that they were working in. Now, therefore, if for that period, they are going to be in an extremely precarious condition. And that condition has to be now acknowledged by the government, by the Supreme Court. And we must make sure that we can reach the resources, including money and food, to them and their families as quickly as possible. Because if it doesn't happen, then we are really looking to a great, grave situation and perhaps large-scale starvation.
Mr. Dave, I don't disagree with you at all on the magnitude of this crisis or this issue. But I'm going to try and put forward, a counter legal argument that some might make, which is not to say that the Supreme Court should not step in to protect the rights of people, but which is also to say that how far can the Supreme Court go? There is a line between what is the rights jurisdiction and what is executive policy making. And even if the Supreme Court were to step across that line, as it often has done in the past, really can it enforce any of those orders? For instance, let me take some of the orders today, right? I think you've read the Supreme Court written order as I have. It came out in the last few minutes. And it says things like the state must ensure, every state must ensure that if there are migrants walking on the road, those migrants are taken care of, fed, and transported as quickly as possible to their homes. How is the Supreme Court going to enforce any of this? And if it can't enforce it, then what is the strength of the Supreme Court's intervention in a matter like this?
Look, there are many issues that you have raised in that question.
Okay.
Let me first begin by answering the last one. You have to look to the order of the Supreme Court in letter and spirit. You are right. It is not possible that every migrant worker and his family walking on every highway in the country can be immediately picked up and put into a bus and taken to his home. But the idea is the Supreme Court today wants to tell, you must realize one thing. And this is where nation has to understand. Today's Supreme Court's order is an acknowledgement of the failure of the central and state governments and every public authority in this country. That is something which you must understand. The Supreme Court has stepped in because the Supreme Court says that the precarious conditions of these millions of migrants is troubling them. Now, so it clearly acknowledges that for 8 weeks, the government has allowed people to really die. There are hundreds of people. Nobody will know how many people have died in this journey for going home. I mean, we have been seeing reports, but those reports are only few of them. So, and besides that, these sufferings and all that people have been going through. Let me tell you what Supreme Court can do. Fortunately for us, and your viewers perhaps would know, that under our constitution, which is a very beautiful document that our forefathers gave us, there are very, very well defined roles by the executive, by the judiciary, and by the parliament, the legislature. Besides that, there is a beautiful, a beautiful part of the constitution, which is the fundamental rights of the citizens. Now, why did the forefathers give those rights? Because they wanted the people to be protected from the executive and from the legislature and perhaps from the judiciary, that those rights were completely inalienable. Those rights were not, tradable, and those rights had to be protected and enforced at all points of time. The forefathers also thought that giving rights is not good enough. We must give remedies. So they created Article 32, which gives every citizen a right to move the Supreme Court for enforcement of his fundamental right. And they gave upon High Court's Article 226 to enforce those and other legal rights. So this is one thing. Now, what could the judiciary have done? See, you have to understand, judiciary must realize that nobody is, nobody is above the law. Whether it's the Prime Minister, whether it's the Speaker, whether it's the President, or whether it's the Chief Justice of India. Everybody is under the law. Under our Constitution, nobody is imperio in imperium. Now, if that is so, every decision of the government, for example, when the demonetization took place, the Supreme Court had an obligation, constitutional obligation and a duty to have tested that decision within 1 week, to ask the government that you satisfy us on what basis you have taken this decision, and two, that what are going to be its consequences. Now, if that was tested at that point of time, the economy would not have suffered since 2016 that it has suffered. Likewise, when lockdown was declared with 4 hours notice, Supreme Court had duty to step in within 4 hours, suo moto, to tell the government that, sorry, Mr. Government, you cannot give 4 hours notice for a lockdown, because in this country, hundreds of millions of people are migratory. And you have shut the railways, you have shut the buses, you have only allowed planes to fly for your honorable MPs to go back home. There are no means by which these people can go. They have no livelihood now. They have no income. They have no more savings. They have no food. What are you going to do? So I don't agree to this, that the Supreme Court or judiciary has no role to play. They have an absolute, clear, defined role under the Constitution, because this really means right to life of citizens under Article 21. And it must stare in the eye of every judge that you have a duty to protect every citizen's right. Tell me one thing, how are you going to compensate the families of those who have died while walking their homes? By giving 5 lakhs and 2 lakhs of rupees? Look, this is not,
I'm not disagreeing. I'm not disagreeing with you, sir. I'm not disagreeing that the Supreme Court has a role to play. I'm just trying to understand from someone like you who has watched this court evolve over many, many years as to where the boundaries lay. For instance, and let me go back to the bit of, if the court had questioned the lockdown, then would the court also be responsible for the spread of the disease sans a lockdown? So I'm just trying to understand, and I want our viewers to understand that at what point does it become imperative for a court to step in? Equally, on the other side, one might argue that several high courts, for instance, the Karnataka High Court, the Andhra Pradesh High Court, they have also questioned their states and the way the states have been handling the migrant issue. So high courts are doing some of the things that the Supreme Court is being accused of being abdicated of. But I'm just asking, where do the boundaries lie?
Look, there is no doubt that there are boundaries. I am not for one suggesting that the judiciary should, go into the executive functioning. No. But the law demands that if the executive functioning is completely arbitrary, which 4 hours lockdown was, then judiciary has duty to find out. Nobody can question lockdown. Nobody says that health of the people should be traded with. Certainly not. I will be the last person to say so, and the Supreme Court will not do that. But the Supreme Court could have then said on 23rd of March that if you want to bring lockdown, please kindly wait for a few days. Have you made the arrangements for these millions of people to go back to their homes? Have you made arrangements for them to eat? Have you made arrangements for them to drink water? Now, that is something which Supreme Court should have done on that particular day. And I am not prepared to accept that any and every fanciful decision that the executive, including the Honorable Prime Minister, takes is not subject to judicial review. There is, Supreme Court itself has said that there is nothing called an unreviewable executive decision, period. So to my mind, it is not right for us to think it. Supreme Court judiciary had to balance between the challenge of coronavirus and balance between protecting the livelihood, the lives of millions and millions of people.
Okay, Mr. Dave, I'm going to ask you one more question in this vein of thought before I move on to some of the other issues I want to tackle, from today's hearing, and that is that, again, this goes to boundaries, right? You would recall, about 6-7 years ago when the Supreme Court stepped in with regards to the 2G matter or the coal auctions and overturned some of these because of wrong due process adopted by the then government. Subsequently, there were impacts on the economy, impacts that were not immediately quantifiable, but played out over a long period of time. And noted Supreme Court lawyers like Mr. Harish Salve have gone on record to say that, part of the reason why the economy has been damaged is the Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court stands up or decides that, all COVID-19 testing should be made free, then, there are questions being raised by civil society saying, oh my God, all the private labs will shut down. How can you make such an economically unsound decision? So again, I go back to boundaries. What is it that we expect the Supreme Court to do or to accomplish in what is obviously an executive failure at handling this migrant problem, whether the failure lies at the center's end or the state's end?
Let me tell you, you are actually comparing apples and oranges. I'm sorry to say that.
No,
I have no doubt about the fact that Supreme Court's intervention in 2G and Colgate was fully justified. Okay. Let us understand one thing. However, deep, far-reaching the consequences may be on the economy. If certain decisions were taken by then government on corrupt and collateral considerations, then I think it is the duty of the judiciary to strike at those decisions. We cannot allow perpetuity in corruption. So that is one thing. Although I don't know what are the details of that, because I'm not concerned about it. But if Supreme Court felt justified in intervening, one has to. And I really wish that the same Supreme Court had stepped in subsequently when present government's decisions were tested, were challenged, like Rafael, like CBI director's removal. All those decisions from 2014, Supreme Court has suddenly gone into, I would say, hiding with great respects, and is been completely unwilling to test the executive's decision. See, let me tell you one thing. There is no doubt about the fact that Prime Minister Modi is one of perhaps the only charismatic leader in the country today, within his own party or within opposition. But that doesn't mean that the judiciary must treat him with kid gloves. Judiciary must, I'm not saying that judiciary should set aside his decision. That's not my job. But I must say that judiciary must critically examine every decision that the government takes, because Constitution is suprema lex. And that Constitution, the judiciary alone has a duty to ensure whether it is fully protected, enforced, and performed by the executive. So merely because, you have a larger than life image of the Honorable Prime Minister doesn't mean that you do not go into these, issues. You have a duty. You may sometimes agree. You may agree with that decision of the Prime Minister. You may sometimes disagree with that decision. So I don't agree with this, that there is a generalized approach that judiciary has adopted since 2014, that hands off. Government has taken a decision, we will not intervene. I think that has hurt the Constitution, that has hurt the nation, and that certainly has hurt the rights of 1.3 billion citizens.
Okay, so you've explained and established why the Supreme Court should have intervened. I have one other question to ask you with regards to, the Supreme Court's approach to this matter, right? There have been almost 4 or 5 different petitions that have, come up to the court in the last month and a half, seeking pretty much the same kind of relief that the court has today ordered. Food for migrants, speedy, efficient travel back home for migrants. And these petitions were given short shrift by various benches in the Supreme Court. Then suddenly, the Supreme Court decides this week that they're going to take suo motu cognizance of the matter, even though 4 or 5 other petitions have already brought this matter to the cognizance of the Supreme Court, and then today does a hearing and announces interim orders. What explains this sudden turnaround?
Well, I can't answer to that, but I can tell you one thing, and I must tell the nation that role of the Supreme Court during the lockdown has been deeply disappointing. Some of the decisions that Supreme Court has given, are so seriously against the citizens and constitutional spirit, constitutional morality, and constitutional principles that one really shudders at the thought that is this the Supreme Court that we love? So I am very clear about the fact that Supreme Court has deeply disappointed us, and the sole reason is this, that judges today across the country, it's not just the Supreme Court, it's now some of the high courts have started, awakening and galvanizing themselves to test the executive. But what has happened since 2014, with deep respects to the judiciary, which I love, I belong to judiciary, I love judiciary, I respect it immensely, that they have virtually accepted everything that this government has done as gospel truth. And this is something not good for us as a nation. And this problem is that every institution which is supposed to protect the constitution has failed us. It's media, civil society, judiciary, you name the legislature. I mean, do you imagine that today in England, Prime Minister is being right now tested by Parliament and its MPs on several decisions that Prime Minister has taken, while our Parliament is sleeping? Not a single committee meeting is taking place. I mean, is this a kind of a constitution that we envisage, that in a crisis Parliament won't meet and test the government? The whole purpose of a democracy that we have, parliamentary democracy, is that the executive decisions will be tested on the floor of the Parliament on daily basis. That's what Ambedkar wanted. He said that American style of democracy is not good for India, because we want a parliamentary democracy, not a presidential form of government, where our government will be tested on the floor of the Parliament. Now, Parliament is completely sleeping. Judiciary did not react. The executive had a field day. What has happened? Hundreds of millions of Indians have suffered without any remorse, without, government should come forward and acknowledge its mistake. It should apologize to the country.
Mr. Dave, would you agree that much of the blame, while it may lie at the central government's doorstep because they imposed the lockdown, but in the issue of migrant workers, the blame is equally distributed across states, and why to states? The employers of these migrant workers, which are industries and companies, are equally to be blamed because they were simply not provided for at any level, at the micro level of employment and employer, at the level of the state. And then there was obviously no effort made to be able to speedily get them back home when we first discovered that most of them were walking home. When the order did finally come from the center, it was for states to provide buses. And it was only a couple of days after that that the center, in fact, agreed to run trains to bring them home. So this is a multiple level of responsibility or abdication of responsibility that's taken place.
Let me answer you from the perspective of a migrant labor. The failure is all around. Everybody has failed them. Why I talk about, have you seen a single member of parliament or a legislative assembly walking on the roads with the migrant labor and reassuring him or helping him or giving a helping hand to him? Everybody has failed. Civil society is doing something good in patches, but it's not enough. Failure, it is a failure of, let me put it bluntly, this is a war between the haves and have-nots. And the haves, like you and me and everybody, we have all failed. We have all failed them, and as I said earlier, when history is written, we will all be condemned. We must bear the cross on our chest, and we must really feel what we have done. We have done nothing to, except watching them, except feeling sorry for them. We have done nothing for them. These kind of measures that are being taken in bits and patches, you think are they enough? Have you seen the photographs of those migrant workers with their children on their shoulders, with their bags on their heads, and their wives walking behind? Is this a democracy that our forefathers wanted us to have? I'm sorry. They fought for us, they led their lives for us. Hundreds of millions of Indians died in freedom struggle. They didn't want this India. Every one of us has failed, and sooner we realize, sooner we start acknowledging that, and sooner we say sorry to them collectively, it's better for us as a nation. Our conscience is dead, let me tell you. It is the conscience of the people who matter which is dead. And unless that conscience is stirred up, nothing is going to happen, because we have hijacked this country from these hundreds of millions of people. It is only 100 or 200 million people of this country who are controlling this country, and they have done nothing for those 1.1 billion people. I'm sorry to say that, but this is too serious. This is too, I would say, important a debate which we must face as a nation. We must, it's not good enough to, everybody is sending all kinds of messages on WhatsApp and on television, every star and every person who matters in this country. What does that do to those people who continue to suffer after 8 weeks? You see the scenes what are happening in Surat. We are lathi charging them, we are tear gassing them. People are, corruption is so bad that migrant workers have to pay money to get train tickets. Where have we come to? That even in these times, bad times, these so-called haves are still willing to extract money out of them, and government is silent. I have not seen a single report by the government saying that we have arrested those people. What kind of nation we are today?
Mr. Dave, I understand. That is a very impassioned argument, and I understand, the across the board. But I'll come back to the theme of today's debate, which, broadly was, what can the Supreme Court do more? Can you hear me now? I'll come back to the theme of. I'll come back to the theme of today's debate, which is specifically what can the Supreme Court do more to ameliorate this situation. There were some legal arguments made in court today by Kapil Sibal and Abhishek Manu Singhvi, both who are lawyers and Congress leaders, with regards to the framework of the NDMA. But since the Solicitor General did not counter them in much detail, I won't get into that now. I expect the subsequent hearing this will get tackled with. I'll leave with one last question. The Solicitors General said two very interesting things in court today, which has raised eyebrows. He said he told the Supreme Court bench this, before entertaining any of the interveners, ask them to file an affidavit on what has been their contribution, except for writing on social media, penning articles, and giving interviews. I thought that was a rather unique way of disincluding an argument in court. But the second thing that he said was a little bit more alarming. He said that some high courts in this country are running parallel governments. I want your assessment of the Solicitor General's way of approaching this issue.
Well, Mr. Tushar Mehta is a friend. So, but with great respect to him, I must say one thing, that, these are not the submissions that a law officer makes. This is a very serious issue that must be confronted by the nation, that the law officers, and I have known at least one law officer, Mr. J.M. Thakur, who was the Advocate General of Gujarat for almost 40 years, who groomed me in one sense. It would be inconceivable that law officers in the past of the stature of Motilal Setalwad or Daftari or J.M. Thakur, Gujarat Advocate General, would have ever raised this kind of a submission. I think it's not in good taste for Mr. Mehta to raise these submissions. Two things. Ultimately, when as lawyers we appear in court, we do it for a cause. Whether we personally believe in that cause or not is not relevant. It's something which is to be left to our conscience. We may not help. I mean, I have no doubt that Mr. Sibal and all those who appeared today have contributed in their own way to the cause of the migrant labor and to the citizens of this country. Secondly, so far as the high courts are concerned, I don't think it's really the high courts are running the administration. The administrations are failing. You must realize one thing, that the administrations are failing because of wrong decisions that they take. And one of the reasons why the administrations are not doing well, take for example Kerala. Why is it that Kerala is able to fight the COVID-19 war much better than most states? Kerala government is talking to the top doctors on virtually daily basis to get the right advice from them. Now, take for example Gujarat, from where I and Mr. Mehta both come. The government has constituted a committee of top doctors. Not one of them is an epidemiologist. Somebody is a heart specialist, somebody is an orthopedic surgeon. Are they really the people who can advise the government? Now, governments are making such serious mistakes about handling this crisis that it has therefore resulted in chaotic conditions. Today in Ahmedabad, it's one of the fastest growing, COVID-19 situation. The death rates in Gujarat is highest in the country today, 7%, as against 4% on an average basis. Now, why has that happened? One, of course, because of visit by President Trump and arrival of hundreds of or maybe thousands of NRIs who came to attend that. Secondly, the Gujarat government is not acknowledging what has really been happening. Likewise, for example, the civil hospital, if you see the scenes on Gujarati television channels, which I see regularly, it's really appalling. It hurts us that people are being treated the way they are being treated. So what else will the High Court do except to intervene? So I think the High Courts have a constitutional duty, and I don't see anything wrong with the High Court, whether it is Karnataka, whether it is Tamil Nadu, whether it is Gujarat. Every High Court has rightly intervened. Maybe late, but ultimately the only people who can stand between the executive tyranny or executive, I would say, failure and the constitutional rights are the High Courts, and they have a duty. And I would encourage, I acknowledge that the High Courts have done right thing. I applaud them. I congratulate them. I express gratitude to them on behalf of hundreds of millions of migrants or the COVID-19 patients. And I tell them that please don't stop here. Go as far as you can. Do not worry about the executive. Do not worry about the submissions of the law officers. Continue with what you want to do, because that's what your constitutional obligation is. That's what your constitutional duty is.
Mr. Dave, you explained to us both the boundaries of the Supreme Court, the behavior of law officers, as well as the role of the High Courts in this entire situation. The next hearing is in June, and we hope that we will hear more from the Supreme Court on the way this situation has been handled. For now, at least, like you said, we should be grateful for the little relief that has come the way of India's migrant workers. Too little, too late, but at least some action has been taken. Thank you so much for your time this evening, and thank you for speaking to BloombergQuint.
Thank you very, very much.